All right, hello everyone. So I've got about 8 to 10 minutes to speak, and what I wanted to try to achieve in that time is firstly just provide an overview of the status of the nation-state law within the Israeli constitution and what we can say that this law means about the way that the state of Israel is currently constituted. Secondly, I want to look in a little bit more depth at the Article 1 of the law and describe what it says and how it violates principles of international law. And finally, briefly address what can or should be done about this law by the international community. Bear with me because, first of all, I wasn't sure I was going to make it today. I'm very jet-lagged, and so I'll do my best to be coherent, and also bear with me with the fact that I will probably repeat some of the excellent points that have been already made by previous speakers. But I think, hopefully, that will still be useful in terms of really reinforcing the exceptional nature of this law and the exceptional characteristics that it has. So the first thing I wanted to say about the nation-state law is that it is a constitutional law that determines the way the state of Israel is now defined, and it determines the identity of the political community that the state represents. So this was a point that was actually made by a legal advisor to the Justice Minister in 2015 when the law was being debated as a bill through the Israeli Knesset. And what was said then is that the law amounts to a so-called constitutional anchoring of the vision of the state. So, in other words, it's not just an ordinary law, it's a law that has been described as having a kind of meta-constitutional status. It defines who are the people that the state of Israel is constituted on behalf of, who is the political community that the state of Israel represents and serves. And this is important for reasons that I hope will become clear. Now, bearing in mind, therefore, this kind of meta-constitutional status of the law, let's look at what it says in Article 1. It says that, and this has already been mentioned, I think, by Youssef Jabarin, the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, this is Article 1 of the law, is the historical homeland of the Jewish people in which the state of Israel was established. It goes on to say, the state of Israel is a nation-state of the Jewish people in which it realizes its historical right to self-determination, and the realization of this right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. Therefore, what the law does in Article 1 is clearly establishes the state of Israel as an ethnocratic rather than as a democratic state. And the reason for this is it stipulates that the people, or the political community, which constitutes a sovereign that the state serves and represents, is one particular ethnic national group that the state controls, and that is the Jewish ethno-national group. So in that sense, because of the status of the law as providing this constitutional anchoring of the state, because of the fact that the law says the state of Israel is the state of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people alone have rights to self-determination in the land of Israel, clearly the law makes Israel, constitutionally speaking, an ethnocratic rather than a democratic regime. So a state that represents one ethnic group rather than a state that represents all of the residents of the territory that the state controls. And so the latter is the normal arrangement that you see in most democratic countries around the world. We know that in Article 1 also the law says Jews have an exclusive right to self-determination in the land of Israel, and therefore it denies parallel self-determination rights to the Palestinians or to any other group. Now, I just also want to draw your attention to the fact that the nature of the law in providing in essentially defining the state of Israel as serving only the Jewish group and therefore providing domination for that group and exclusivity to that group was deliberate. So again, we know that the legal advisor to the Knesset committee responsible for drafting the law actually pointed this out and said this is problematic and suggested that the law be modified to include a provision on equality and a provision that said the state of Israel is nonetheless still a state of all its citizens. And that suggestion to include that provision was explicitly rejected by the drafters of the law. So we need to be clear about the deliberate nature of the law in creating the situation of domination for the Jewish group. Also, a comparative study that this same Knesset committee carried out in the during the drafting process established that in the world there is currently no other state constitution which appropriates the state or the regime exclusively for one ethnic group. So there may have been in the past such constitutions, as we've heard from Chief Mandela, but currently there isn't any other state constitution in the world that purports that the state represents only one ethnic group and no other. So let's go on to what this Article 1 of the law, what does it contravene in terms of principles of international law? Well, very briefly, because it's already been touched upon. Firstly, it violates the right to equality and for all citizens of states to be free from discrimination by the state under international human rights law. And that much is clear. Secondly, it clearly violates the Palestinian right to self-determination in at least a part of the territory of mandatory Palestine, because it says that only the Jewish group has the right to self-determination in Eretz Israel, so it says the land of Israel and the state of Israel, and it doesn't define precisely where the borders of that territory are, which means that it can easily be construed as meaning that this law applies to the whole of historic Palestine and therefore covers the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which are the areas in which Palestinians have a right to self-determination. And it says only Jewish people may have a self-determination right in that entire territory, right? And in as much as it does that and it suppresses the Palestinian right to self-determination, which is internationally recognized, the law can also be said to be colonial in nature, to establish Israel as a colonial regime. And finally, it codifies or it adds to the already large body of evidence that Israel is an apartheid state. And I won't go into that further because we've already heard about that. So, as you can see, I think the law is a serious development in the Israel-Palestine context. It's not, as some people might say, merely declaratory and, it's telling us what we already know. I think, in a sense, it does move matters further along, in the sense that it really explicitly anchors, and defines Israel's constitution, as I said, in this ethnocratic way. And it violates these fundamental tenets of equality, the prohibition against colonialism, the prohibition against apartheid. So the final question is, what should the response of the international community be to the passing of this law? And I would suggest that the law makes it inarguable that Israel currently is constituted as an apartheid state and a state that has a colonial character. And that being the case, international law imposes certain obligations on what are called third states, that's states who are not Israel or Palestine, but on our state or others around the world. And that obligation is to cooperate with other states to bring in an end to regimes like this that are apartheid in nature, and not to render assistance to such regimes or to recognize the unlawful acts resulting from those regimes. So in other words, now this can be done unilaterally. States can take their own actions, or they can act cooperatively through the United Nations, for example. But the point is that I think the argument can be made to decision makers in the international community that this law means that third states need to act differently towards Israel and to abide by their own legal obligations, which is to uphold the international order by helping to bring about an end to the violations that this law codifies and will result in. So thanks very much.